The screaming began at dawn. Not the screams of joy or celebration, though those would come later, forced and hollow. No, these were different. Raw, primal. The kind that clawed their way up from the deepest chambers of the human soul and shattered against the marble walls of Rome's most elegant homes. They were the screams of a girl who knew exactly what was coming, who had been warned by the women in her family with trembling voices and averted eyes, who had perhaps seen the aftermath in an older sister's haunted stare. Her name was Cornelia. She was 14 years old, and today was her wedding day. If you're drawn to the forgotten nightmares of history, the rituals we've buried beneath sanitized textbooks, then follow this channel. Because what you're about to hear isn't just dark, it's true. The year is 63 BCE. Rome stands at the precipice of transformation, caught between republic and empire, between the old gods and new ambitions. The streets reek of wine, sweat, and the coppery tang of blood from the morning's animal sacrifices. Cornelia's father, Marcus Aurelius Cotta, a name that carries weight in the Senate, though not as much weight as it once did, has arranged a marriage that will secure his family's position for another generation. The groom is 47 years old. He is a friend of her father's. She has seen him at dinner parties, watched him recline on the triclinium with wine-stained lips, heard him laugh at jokes she didn't understand. His name is Gaius Sempronius Gracchus. No relation to the famous brothers, though he enjoys the confusion, and he is, by all accounts, a man of considerable appetites. But let's not begin with Cornelia. Not yet. To understand the true horror of what's about to unfold, we must first understand the ritual itself. The confariatio, the most sacred and binding form of Roman marriage, reserved for patrician families who still clung to the old ways like shipwreck survivors clutching driftwood. The confariatio wasn't just a wedding. It was a religious ceremony so ancient that even Romans of the 1st century BCE barely understood its origins. It required the presence of the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, and the Flamen Dialis, the priest of Jupiter himself, 10 witnesses from Rome's most distinguished families. And most importantly, it required a particular sacrifice, a particular oath, and a particular consummation. That last word should make you uncomfortable. Hold on to that feeling. The preparation began 3 days before the ceremony. Cornelia was taken from her childhood bedroom, the room where she'd played with wax dolls and dreamed of heroines from Greek myths, and moved to a windowless chamber in the center of her family's villa. The Romans called this room the thalamus, the bridal chamber, though cell would have been more accurate. Here, she was bathed in water drawn from a sacred spring, scrubbed until her skin turned pink and raw. Her body hair was plucked, every strand from eyebrow to ankle, a process that left her bleeding in places, whimpering in others. The older women who performed this ritual worked in silence, their faces carved from stone, their hands efficient and merciless. "It must be done," her mother whispered once, the only words of comfort offered across 3 days. "Every patrician girl endures it. I endured it. Your grandmother endured it. It is the price of nobility." But what, exactly, was being purchased with this price? On the morning of the wedding, Cornelia was dressed in the tunica recta, a straight white tunic woven on an archaic upright loom, in a style so old that no one could remember its original purpose. Around her waist, they tied the cingulum, a knot of Herculean complexity. Legend claimed that Hercules himself had designed it, that only her husband would be allowed to untie. We'll return to that knot. Remember it. Her hair was arranged in the sine crines, 6 braids separated by a spear that had been dipped in the blood of a gladiator who had died bravely. The symbolism was unmistakable. She was a captive, taken by conquest, her maidenhood to be pierced, just as Rome's enemies were pierced on the battlefield. Over her face, they placed the flammeum, a flame-colored veil that obscured her features, turned her into a ghost at her own wedding. Beneath that veil, her eyes were red from crying, but her tears had been spent. There was only numbness now, and a creeping dread that tasted like copper on her tongue. The ceremony itself, took place in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, that magnificent structure that crowned the Capitoline Hill and surveyed Rome like a marble god. The morning sun slanted through the entrance, illuminating motes of dust and incense smoke, creating an atmosphere that felt both divine and suffocating. The guests arrived in their finest togas, purple-striped for senators, blindingly white for the equestrian class. They came not out of affection for the bride or groom, most had never met Cornelia, but because the confariatio required their witness. Their presence made the marriage unbreakable, sanctified by the state itself. Gaius Sempronius Gracchus stood at the altar, his toga arranged to perfection, his thin hair oiled and combed across his scalp. He smiled when he saw Cornelia approach, a smile that revealed teeth stained by decades of wine and garum. His hands, thick-fingered, liver-spotted, drummed against his thighs with barely contained anticipation. The Pontifex Maximus began the ritual with words in archaic Latin, so old that they predated the Republic itself, perhaps even the Etruscan kings. The language rolled like thunder. In the presence of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, in the sight of all gods and the witness of Rome, we bind these two souls in sacred matrimony, indissoluble in life, unbreakable in death, indissoluble. That word is crucial. Marriages performed under confariatio could not be dissolved, not by mutual consent, not by adultery, not even by the will of the emperor himself. The only escape was death. Then came the sacrifice. A white heifer was led into the temple, its horns wrapped in wool, its eyes rolling with animal terror. The victimarius, the professional sacrificer, whispered calming words as he positioned the beast, but there was no calming what came next. The blade flashed. Blood fountained across the altar, splashing the hem of Cornelia's tunic, spattering her shoes. The smell hit her like a fist, hot, metallic, overwhelmingly alive, and beneath her veil she gagged. The heifer's legs buckled. It collapsed with a sound like wet thunder, its blood forming rivers that ran along grooves carved into the marble floor, ancient channels designed to direct the sacrifice toward the underworld. The Pontifex Maximus examined the entrails with practiced eyes, reading the future in coils of intestine and the shape of the liver. He nodded. The omens were favorable. Of course they were. They were always favorable at patrician weddings. Now came the confariatio itself, the sharing of the sacred spelt cake, the far, from which the ceremony derived its name. The cake sat on a low table between bride and groom, baked from spelt grain that had been grown on land consecrated to Ceres, goddess of agriculture and marriage. It was hard as stone, tasteless, a relic from an age when Rome was nothing but shepherds on 7 hills. But it represented the binding of 2 houses, the merger of 2 family lines, the creation of legitimate heirs who could hold political office and continue their father's legacies. Gaius broke off a piece and held it to Cornelia's veiled lips. His fingers brushed the cloth, and beneath it, she flinched. "Eat," he commanded, his voice carrying just enough edge to remind everyone present of his authority. She ate. Then she was required to offer him a piece in return, her small hand trembling as she held the crumbling cake toward his mouth. He accepted it with exaggerated ceremony, his lips closing around her fingertips for just a moment too long. The witnesses murmured their approval. "Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia," Cornelia recited, the words catching in her throat. "Where you are, Gaius, there I am Gaia." It was the ritual phrase that every Roman bride spoke, a declaration of absolute submission, of self-erasure. She was no longer Cornelia, she was simply Gaia, the generic wife, the legal property of her husband. The ceremony should have ended there. In most marriages, it did. But the confariatio demanded more. The deductio, the procession to the groom's home, began as the sun reached its apex. Cornelia was placed in a cart, but not comfortably seated like a human being. No, she was symbolically abducted, lifted, and carried struggling, or at least appearing to struggle, by 3 boys whose parents held political ambitions. This wasn't celebration. It was a ritualized kidnapping, a reenactment of the rape of the Sabine women, that foundational myth where Romulus and his followers simply took the women they needed because no neighboring tribes would give them wives willingly. The crowd that followed chanted obscene songs. Yes, obscene. This was part of the tradition. They sang about the wedding night in graphic detail, about what Gaius would do to his young bride, about how she would scream and bleed and submit. They sang these things while her father smiled awkwardly and her mother looked at the ground, while senators laughed and their wives clutched their pearls and tried to pretend this was all in good fun. It wasn't fun. It was terror disguised as celebration. When they reached Gaius's villa, a sprawling complex in the Aventine Hill, all frescoed walls and imported marble, Cornelia was made to perform 3 more rituals. She touched fire and water, the fundamental elements of life. She was lifted over the threshold because to stumble would bring catastrophic bad luck. And she was given 3 coins, one for Gaius, one for the household gods, and one for the crossroads shrine near the house. Then the door closed behind her, and the true horror began. The thalamus in Gaius's home had been prepared with meticulous care. The bed was draped in crimson silk, Roman red, the color of blood and power. The mattress had been stuffed with rose petals, their perfume cloying and overwhelming in the enclosed space. Lamps burned in every corner, removing all shadows, all privacy. This was deliberate. The consummation of a confariatio marriage was not a private affair. The 10 witnesses followed them into the room. Yes, you read that correctly. The 10 witnesses who had attended the ceremony now arranged themselves along the walls of the bridal chamber, their eyes fixed on the bed, their presence required by law and custom. They weren't there out of prurience, though certainly some of them were aroused by what they were about to see. But because the confariatio demanded proof, the marriage had to be consummated in front of witnesses to be valid, to prevent any future claims of fraud or impotence. Cornelia stood beside the bed still wearing her veil, her whole body trembling like a leaf before a storm. Gaius approached her slowly, drawing out the moment. He had paid handsomely for this marriage, a fortune in dowry negotiations, political favors, promises made to her father, and he intended to savor every second. "Remove the veil," he commanded. She did, her hands shaking so violently that she nearly tore the delicate fabric. When her face was revealed, someone in the room actually gasped, not because she was beautiful, though she was in the way that children are beautiful, with soft features and eyes too large for her face, but because she looked so utterly terrified. "Now," Gaius said, his voice thick with anticipation, "the cingulum, the knot. Remember the knot?" This was the moment that the entire ceremony had been building toward. The Herculean knot around Cornelia's waist had been tied by the elder women of her family, and only her husband was permitted to untie it. But this wasn't just about removing clothing. The knot represented her virginity, and the manner in which it was untied was rich with symbolism. Gaius was expected to untie it carefully, slowly, speaking prayers to Juno Cinxia, the goddess who presided over the loosening of the virgin's girdle. He was supposed to show patience, tenderness even, acknowledging the significance of what he was about to take. He did not. He grabbed the knot with both hands and yanked, so violently that Cornelia stumbled forward with a cry of pain. The fabric cut into her skin before it gave way, leaving angry red welts around her waist. The tunica recta fell open, and she was revealed in the lamplight, her body still bearing the marks and bruises from her 3-day preparation. "Lie down," Gaius ordered. She didn't move. Couldn't move. Fear had turned her body to marble. "I said lie down." One of the witnesses, an older senator with a face like cracked leather, cleared his throat. "The girl requires instruction, Gracchus. She's young. The first time always requires patience." But patience was not what Gaius had purchased. He had paid for absolute submission, for the right to do as he pleased with his property. He grabbed Cornelia's arm and threw her onto the bed. She landed hard, the breath knocked from her lungs, and before she could recover, he was on top of her. What followed cannot be described in detail, not out of prudishness, but out of respect for every girl who has suffered through something similar, in ancient Rome or anywhere else, in any era. But understand this, it was not lovemaking. It was not even the rough coupling of two people driven by lust. It was violence. It was penetration as punishment, as demonstration of power, as the ultimate expression of Roman masculine authority. And the witnesses watched. They stood against the walls, their faces impassive, their eyes tracking every movement. When Cornelia screamed, and she did scream, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her body, they did not flinch. When she begged him to stop, and she did beg in a voice made small by pain, they did not intervene. When blood stained the rose petals beneath her, and there was blood, far more than there should have been, they merely noted it as proof of her virginity. The entire ordeal lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though for Cornelia it must have felt like hours, like lifetimes. When Gaius finally finished, he stood from the bed, adjusted his clothing, and turned to the witnesses with a satisfied smile. "The marriage is consummated," he declared. "Let the record show that the union is complete and binding." The witnesses nodded. One of them, a younger man who looked slightly ill, made a notation on a wax tablet. Legal proof. Undeniable. Eternal. Cornelia lay on the bed, curled into herself, her body shaking with sobs she no longer had the strength to voice. No one went to her. No one offered comfort. The women of her family were not permitted in the room during consummation, and the witnesses were not there to provide comfort, only testimony. After a few moments, Gaius waved his hand dismissively. "Leave us. The deed is done." The witnesses filed out silently, their sandals clicking against the marble floor. The door closed, and Cornelia was left alone with her husband, in a marriage that could never be dissolved, in a home that was now her prison. This is the part where you might expect redemption, where some kindly slave girl helps Cornelia escape, or where divine intervention strikes Gaius dead, or where the whole thing is revealed to be an exaggerated tale, a dark legend with no basis in fact. But there is no redemption here. This is not legend. This is history. The confarreatio was real. The public consummation was real. The indissoluble nature of the marriage was real. These practices were not aberrations or the acts of particularly cruel individuals. They were the law, sanctified by religion, enforced by the state, accepted by society. And Cornelia's story, though she herself is a composite, drawn from the lives of dozens of real patrician girls, represents a truth that Rome tried to bury beneath rhetoric about virtue and honor and pietas. The truth that the foundation of Roman civilization was built on the bodies of girls who had no choice, no voice, no escape. The confarreatio gradually fell out of practice during the imperial period, not because Romans developed more enlightened views on consent and marriage, but because it was too restrictive for the political needs of the aristocracy. Emperors needed the ability to dissolve marriages, to forge new alliances, to discard wives who failed to produce sons. The old ritual, with its emphasis on permanence, became inconvenient. But for centuries before that, girls like Cornelia endured it. They were bathed and plucked and dressed like sacrificial animals. They were symbolically kidnapped and actually raped, all while senators and priests looked on and called it sacred. They spent their wedding nights in agony and then woke the next morning to a life of service to men who saw them as property, as breeding stock, as the continuation of family lines. Some of them adapted. Some found ways to exert subtle power within the confines of their bondage. Some even claimed to be happy, to love their husbands, though we must wonder how much of that was genuine and how much was the ultimate survival mechanism, convincing yourself that your cage is a home. Others broke. They withdrew into madness or melancholy. They died in childbirth, their bodies too young to safely deliver. They took their own lives, leaving behind cursory explanations or no explanations at all. And Rome simply found more girls to replace them. If you walk through Rome today, you can still see the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, or at least the foundations where it once stood. You can climb the Capitoline Hill and look out over the Forum, imagining the ceremonies that took place there, the sacrifices performed, the oaths sworn. But if you're quiet, if you silence the noise of tourists and traffic and the relentless machinery of modern life, you might hear something else, something that echoes up from the stones themselves, from the blood grooves in the marble, from the cells where brides were prepared. You might hear screaming, the screaming of girls who were told this was an honor, the screaming of girls who were told to endure, the screaming of girls whose names we've forgotten, but whose suffering remains, fossilized in history like insects trapped in amber. And perhaps the most disturbing part of all is this. When we read about ancient Rome, we're taught to admire it. The architecture, the engineering, the military genius, the legal innovations that still influence our laws today. We're told that Rome was civilization at its peak, the foundation of Western culture, the empire that brought order to chaos. But civilizations are built by people, and people can sanctify any horror if they call it tradition. Cornelia's screams echoed through Rome for one terrible night, and then they were forgotten, absorbed into the ambient noise of empire. But they should not be forgotten. None of them should be forgotten. Because the conferratio may be dead, but the impulse behind it, the belief that tradition justifies suffering, that power grants entitlement, that some people exist to be consumed by others, that impulse is very much alive, and it is still screaming, if we have ears to hear it.